it's dedication. So, I mean, Laura has done quite a bit of work at the intersection of aesthetics, environmental philosophy, landscape philosophy, philosophy of medicine, and also philosophy of psychology. She's worked a lot on landscaping, on the significance of landscape, on the notion of health and how health relates to its environment, which we will hear about a bit today. I'd like to flag out one of her articles, which actually I knew before meeting you, the one in Frontiers in Psychology, 2016, Landscape and Health, which is really a very, very nice paper, which I highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of question. And today, Laura is going to be talking about health and environment, a relational factors.
Thank you. So thank you. And well, today I will present an ongoing research. You can hear me? Yeah. An ongoing research about the relationship between health and environment, and I'm trying to develop a relational and situated account. I forgot to put situated in the title. So my sources are environmental philosophy and landscape philosophy is where I'm from. And in the last years, I got closer to philosophy of medicine and philosophy of biology. How I developed this relational account before by doing a research of the state of the art, and the state of the art consists in analyzing different medical documents about the mainstream definition of health, analyzing the history of medicine, and then digging deeper in philosophy. And I use three concepts that I will explain today: adaptation, adaptivity, and salutogenesis, to explain this account. Why? Well, this is massively interesting from a philosophical point of view. And also because it's important in medical education. I think I've seen a little bit practicing this framework in teaching to medical students and healthcare professionals that is needed, and also to inform health policies. And with regard to this, I will present two case studies. I think that for the time we will be able to see just one, but sometimes trying to understand, trying to capture the role of the environments in health, in philosophy of medicine, in medical documents, it's like to play at where is Waldo, because it's quite complicated. And there are different problems, or the environment is not considered in the definition of health, in medical documents, or it is overlooked, or it is, I will explain to you in a moment, described as merely as pathogenic. So this is the mainstream definition of health. I know that this is from the 1948, but in medical education is the most used. It's still the one that informed a lot of teaching in medical education, and they say that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Okay, this definition has been massively questioned and discussed by philosophy of medicine. It is a positive definition, because the negative one will be, okay, disease is just the absence of health, is just the absence of disease. This definition has some merits. For example, that introduces the concept of social, the notion of well-being, even if then the notion of well-being is not well defined. So, but and also this definition has few problems. The first one is this adjective complete. I dare every one of you to say that you have a complete physical, mental, and social well-being. After 2 years of pandemic, wherever in your life. So that is a massive problem. The other problem is that the environment doesn't appear in this definition. And well, we could say that maybe the environment is there in the social characterization, but is too vague. And of course, I know that there are many international documents that have calling for the importance of the environment in healthcare and medical theory. There are many. I will focus on two, a document by WHO in the 1984 and the Ottawa Charter in 1986. I have studied all the other documents, especially, well, the OneHealth approach developing in 2009 has been re-emerged in these two last years of pandemics. But I think that is, especially in that documents, I will show you later, that there are two concepts that could be very useful to develop a relational account of health with the environment. And it is based on two ideas. Health is coping with the environment. Health is creating supportive environments. These are two concepts that are guiding my reflection in these two last years. Well, another problems in all this state of the art about the health and environment coupling is that in the most cases, the environment is described as pathogenic. Okay, the terms pathogenesis comes from Latin, pathos means disease, genesis, production, and the pathogenic approach has informed pathology and the branches of medicine that analyzed how the environment is responsible for various forms of cellular disease. And it is the development of morbid condition of disease. This is an approach that is consubstantial to medicine. And okay, if you didn't grow up in a farm like I did, you didn't know that, for example, there are a lot of diseases that you can catch from animals. And I think in the last 2 years, terms like zoonosis or spillover have been popularized, but in a very interesting way, I think, and in a very productive way, also to scare us. I think that every one of us who sees a bat in his garden this summer will be a little bit freaked out. But zoonosis is a normal and a typical thing, because the 60% of all infection diseases in humans comes from transmission from animals. And this characterization of the environment, even if it's right and correct, describe the environment as a carrier of viruses and a menace for human beings. So it focuses on idea of the environment as generators of problems. Another way in which, in all the literature, the environment has been described is related to climate change. So another pathogenic thing, another pathogenic effect. In the 2009, there is this pioneer Lancet editorial, which is titled Managing the Health Effects of Climate Change, in which the decrease in biodiversity and climate change becomes a major problem in public health. And so, for the first time, climate change cannot be considered as an environmental issue, but health-related problem related to public health or to population health. But the characterization of the environment is or sometimes overlooked, or described in terms of pathogenic environment, or described in terms of climate change. The IPCC has been released 2 days ago, and of course this is the direction of public health policies. But we could reflect a little bit about which idea of the environment has related to health we are developing in all these documents. Okay, philosophy of medicine. In philosophy of medicine, well, the role of the environment is sometimes overlooked, often overlooked, I think, when defining health. And in philosophy of medicine, okay, here there are philosophers of medicine better than me, And the big debates is about, one of the big debates is about how we define health and disease. And there is an opposition, I could say, as always among philosophers, between objectivist and constructivist. In defining health and disease, roughly speaking, objectivist thinks that health is not a value-free concept, and health and disease depends only on physical facts. So biological, physiological, or other natural facts. And well, philosopher of medicine knows that one of the most prominent naturalist account in philosophy of medicine is the one given by Boers. That debates have been debating a lot on what is health and what is disease. And on the other side, there are all the theories which thinks, all the researchers which thinks that health and disease are value laden. When we define health, when we define what is a disease, the social and cultural, the value laden account cannot be forgotten. But the problem is that even if in these big debates, the environment is or a set of conditions, physicals, that can put health at risk, or a set of cultural, social conditions that can put health, again, at risk. So well, maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't find in all this literature an extensive account of the environment as related to health. Of course, there are some exceptions. Canguilhem is one of these, and especially the idea of the contextualism in Canguilhem, all the French researchers know this. But even there, the contextualism from Canguilhem is a very specific branch of research, and sometimes it's not clear where the evolutionary basic theory is overlapping with the physiological theory in Canguilhem. So, but it's interesting that in a 2009, another Lancet editorial, health is defined as the ability to adapt. And they use this book by Canguilhem, Canguilhem was a philosopher and a physician, a French physician, that wrote a book, The Normal and the Pathological, in 1943, then revised in another edition in 1966. The introduction of the book is by Michel Foucault. It's quite interesting that in this editorial, the author says that thanks to Canguilhem, health can be considered as the ability to adapt to one's environment. Health is not a fixed entity. It varies for every individual depending on their circumstances. Okay, here there is a massive problem in philosophy of medicine, and Boers had a massive fight against Canguilhem about the contextualism. But for the sake of my arguments, and also for the sake of the importance of the environment in health, the authors takes this idea that adapt to the environment is important for defining both disease and health, and for taking into account the concept of condition in a particular place as well as time. So after reading all this literature, this interesting literature about the health and environment relationship, or I could change topic, or I could try at least to develop a relational and situated account of health. Because coming from landscape theory and environmental philosophy, I think that the where of health has to play a more extensive role. And I go back to two documents, as I told before, by the WHO in the 1984, and where health is defined as the extent to which an individual or group is able to realize aspiration and satisfy needs and to change or cope with the environment. That's the first concept I started from. And this definition has been taken up by the Ottawa Charter in 1986. And in that charter, the authors identify 6 areas of action for health promotion. Among them, create a supportive environment. And then it's what I think allows me to link environmental philosophy, landscape theory also with philosophy of medicine. And I try to specify from a philosophical point of view, what does it mean cope with the environment? Okay, I think one of the possibilities, I don't think if it's the only one, because I think the health environment coupling is quite complicated, but cope with the environment could mean and could be explained by 2 concepts, adaptation and adaptivity. Both lead us to the idea of salutogenesis. Okay, what is adaptation? To explain adaptation, we have to go back to public health or population health. And it is a concept used also in environmental philosophy. During the last meeting in Glasgow about the climate, we have seen like these 2 terms, adaptation and mitigation, emerge with force. They are the same terms used in public health, because adaptation refers to measures and strategies and intervention regarding climate change exposure and adverse effect of climate change. Why? To protect vulnerable individuals and communities. What does it mean? That, well, climate change is already here, as the IPCC panel and documents released 2 days ago demonstrates. And there are a lot of adverse health impact of climate change on our health. Among them, health waves, tropical cyclone, hurricane, vector-borne diseases, tick-borne diseases, waterborne diseases. All these elements of climate change has a direct impact on vulnerable individuals and communities. The idea of adapt to climate change from a healthcare perspective is to develop prevention and not just mitigation, because mitigation is used to describe primary prevention, such as the reduction of greenhouse gases emission in private and public sectors. Adaptation is what we do in case of climate change disruptive events on health. So we do from a medical point of view, community point of view, social point of view, we try to develop structural strategies to cope with this negative effect. I cannot go in detail about this, but there are a sort of hierarchical steps to follow. There is a framework of action called BRACE. And for example, in case of heat waves that are quite important and negative of health of population and of health of vulnerable population, there are a few steps to follow, like surveillance, gather data on population, develop a heat response plan, partner with local organization and agency to provide heat adaptation, education and assistance, and eventually, but this is a debated thing, plan long-term community design solutions. So act directly on the territory, on the design, on the architecture, to not mitigate, but to adapt to the massive change of climate change. One of the definitions of adaptation, which is interesting, I think, in order to develop this framework between health and environment, is this. Adaptation is the adjustment, natural or human system, to a new or changing environment that explores these beneficial opportunities or moderate negative effects. So it's not, and I will explain why I think it's quite interesting. Here we are not speaking about a perturbation from the environment, an hurricane, a heat waves, a waterborne disease, or something else that we have to simply stop. The idea introduced by these beneficial opportunities is more similar to the idea of adaptivity, for example, that is useful that we can take from philosophy of biology. And I'm coming to this point. So, which is the problem with the idea of adaptation as used in public health? That sometimes, well, we don't question the value of adaptation in medical practice. But in many cases, the environment is seen as something pathogenic, in which an element, a negative and disruptive element of climate change has to be stopped. So, and the response is obviously a posteriori, because climate change has already happened here. So I was thinking, okay, maybe in philosophy, sometimes happens, maybe in philosophy there are something that help us to better understand how we can cope with the environment, how we can adapt with the environment. Okay, and adaptivity in philosophy of biology could be useful in it. So, okay. Okay, what is adaptivity in philosophy of biology? This is a general definition given by Ezequiel Di Paolo. And adaptivity is the capability of a system, such an organism, to remain viable in its environment by regulating itself. Okay, it's related to the physiology and behavior of the organism. Is a generic definition, because the history of adaptivity is far more complicated. And we can say that we can make a principal distinction between two ways of conceptualizing adaptivity. That is how a system adapts to the environment. The first one is based on the idea of stability and the idea of returning of the system after a perturbance from the environment to its initial states or its variable states. And so it has more to do with the idea of consensus as elaborated by Claude Bernard at the end of the 18th century, and the capability of the organism to maintain some variables stable, as has been defined by canon as homeostasis. But the story is not so simple, because the history both of adaptivity has evolved, has been complicated, as always, by philosophers of biology. And a second way to understand what does it mean adapt to the environment comes from, for example, from the idea of the fact that the system reorganizes itself to respond to environmental perturbation, and that the system is more focused on change than on returning back to its stability. That's from Jean Piaget, but from the current theorization of adaptivity in philosophy of biology, namely the idea of regulatory adaptivity, that is quite complicated, but it implies that the system has the capability to actively modulate the internal dynamics, its internal dynamics and its behavior in relation to the variation both internal and both external, by means of specific mechanism that operates on the basis of the evaluation, of course, of internal and external condition of the system. This is big. Well, the definition is quite complicated, but why is it interesting, this approach in philosophy of biology? Because there are two different strategies of how we adapt, or how a system, how an organism adapt to the environment. We have the conservative ones, like blocking the perturbation, like returning to the initial state. Let's talk not just about microbes, but also, for example, during this pandemic. the conservative one and the classical, I would say, homeostatic ways of pandemic strategies could be, for example, social distancing, using of mask. There are the other possibility, the different possibility is that the system changes with the changes with the environment. So the system change by means of its internal variability, its modulation with respect to the environment and the perturbations, as is missing, of the environment. Okay, some microbes, some animals demonstrate that this adaptation, this adaptivity to the environment is possible thanks to change in metabolic rates, change direction of movement, change in temperature. But let's see, for example, the current pandemic. There are few cases in which the system not just block a perturbation, but changes itself in order to create also supportive environment. And I will show two case studies. So this idea of adaptivity that is not opposed to the first one, because when we talk about adaptivity in philosophy of biology, it's like to recur in an historical path, starting from canon, from the concept of homeostasis, that has been questioned by, I don't know, concepts such as ataraxis, allostasis. So it's not out. It's like an evolution of the idea of adaptivity by means of the observation of the relationship between the organism and the environment. But what is interesting here is what the environment's results also thanks to this account of adaptivity. An environment which is characterized as absolutely relational to the system or to the organism, and an environment which does not constitute a set of independent boundary conditions affecting a system, but in the idea of co-constitution, the environment interacts with the system in not a necessarily negative way. So what is this environment at the end? A source of opportunities. From a cognitive point of view, in the paper that Edouard just mentioned, this set of opportunities were called affordances, but use the term affordances here is a little bit more complicated. But it's important that it's a source of opportunity, and this idea of adaptivity describes an approach focusing on engaging with and taking advantage of the both variability of the system and the change in the environment, instead of simply blocking and considering it as a perturbation. So what is in the end, or what I'm starting to see in this scenario, that health could be defined as cope with the environment by creating, and I add something more, by creating supportive environments. So the notion of health in a paper we are hoping publishing soon, because it's been a long process, a long pandemic process. Yeah. The notion of health should not include environmental noise and potentially threatening perturbation, but also the capability to modulate the relationship with the environment to promote the condition of existence of the system, that is to create supportive environments. What are the supportive environments? Okay, for me, the supportive environments can be called salutogenic environments. Okay, the salutogenesis is opposed to pathogenesis in medicine. And well, in Latin, saluto comes from salus, health, genesis, production. And nowadays, in environmental psychology, this term salutogenic is super a la mode. But it means well, in psychology at least, to analyze the possibility offered by green spaces or nature in terms of fostering health and well-being to the human beings. The point is that few people, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but few people know that these terms, salutogenesis, was coined in 1971 by a physician and a sociologist called Aaron Antonovsky. And it's quite long, his history is quite fascinating because he started working on this idea of salutogenesis more related to coping with stress with women that survived the Nazi camps in Israel. And even if the concept of salutogenesis initially means what is called a scale of coherence in coping with the stress after a massive events, later the idea of salutogenesis in medicine means that means an approach in which the preventive action to foster health are important as well as the evaluation of risk for health. So both in Antonovsky's book and in other sociological texts, salutogenesis is more focuses on the study of the origins of health contra the origins of disease. So to develop a preventive idea of healthcare. We cannot go in details in salutogenesis for medicine. There are some studies that have been developed on the opposition between salutogenesis and pathogenesis. One is a chapter by Valles in a 2018 book. But why here the concept of salutogenesis is interesting? Because the supportive environments we have talking about are the salutogenic environments. So environments that provide health, and not just the idea of an environment that is source of perturbation, source of climate change, source of diseases, source of risk. If we want really to analyze which is the relationship within a system, as an organism, and health, we have to we have to study and to consider both the pathogenesis, both the pathogenic effect of the environment and the salutogenic effect of the environment. One way to analyze a mechanism through which we relate with the environment is the idea of adaptivity. So in the end, this account both redefine the idea of health and the environment. If we look at the environment just as a source of pathogenesis, we will try to mitigate the negative effect of environment. Clearly and rightly, I think, through, for example, let's talk about what has been happening in the last 2 years with the COVID-19, about research on the origin of viruses, travel restriction, quarantine, social distancing, vaccine. Perfect. They are all leading to mitigation. But to actually analyze what the environment and health is, we have to focus also on the salutogenic role of the environment. And for example, how we can do it through adaptive mechanisms which foster daily action for health promotion policies, changes in urban design, for example. And one thing that, well, I have analyzed too is prefer community-centered medicine with respect, or complementing, because it's a little bit strong to say, complementing the patient-centered medicine. So I have analyzed 2 case studies of activity and the salutogenic environment during COVID. The first one has been community-centered approach to healthcare. The second one is microbiological healthcare building. Today, I will speak a little bit about the second because it's more scary. And yeah, I'm sorry. No, because we don't have so much time. Now, what does it mean? The bioinformant building design consider the role of pathogens in the air, inside and outside building. It's not a new thing in architecture, but it's a, well, or in engineer too. But in the last year, the research on the airborne spreading of the viruses has been implemented, and the bioinformed building design are about the possibility of controlling the interaction between bacteria inside and outside public and private buildings in order to achieve better working and living conditions. From the philosophical point of view, this is an extension of research in philosophy of science about microbiome that has been developed in the last decades, but it is based on the, well, maybe for philosophy of science is a trivial idea that humans are colonized by microorganisms, and this applies to home, public buildings, and schools. But it's not so trivial. Consider that microorganisms affect human health both in a positive and a negative way, but mostly in a positive way. So for this reason, the bioinformed architecture has focused both on manual ventilation in the last year, which could affect health, but because it's not just about to block a virus entering in our spaces, but to consider that the exchange of microorganisms could be useful for our health. The basic thing could be manual ventilation. Okay, all philosophers of medicine or historian of medicine know the history of Florence Nightingale during the War of Crimea. The fact that just open the window, change it, the microorganism for soldiers. So that is a very simple thing, but it is a very simple adaptive mechanism which demonstrate that we don't need just to eliminate the pathogens, but to create a healthy environment. So designer and architecture designer are trying to think about flexible mechanical ventilation, depending on various purposes, number of occupants, to create healthy environment. And also to maintain or even grow certain types of microbes through what? Not just throwing in a space microbes, okay? But rethinking, for example, cleaning practices, using specific materials in constructions, use of animals. That is, I think, a clear adaptive mechanism to the environment that is adaptive in the sense of the later meaning of adaptivity we have underlined. So I'm coming to the conclusion. These are just few ideas I'm developing, and to think about the definition of health, well, not just for the current scenario, but to rethink the idea of health as related of the environment for philosophy and also for medical education through two concepts: cope with the environment and adapt with the environment. These two ideas of adaptation and adaptive regulation emphasize the salutogenic dimension of the environment. I try to show this through design. Another example is for example, the community-based medicine implemented in the last 2 years, starting from an Italian example. So if you want, we could focus on it maybe later. But also the credits. I'm working with Bernardo Bic, who appears to be here. Say hello, and is the one who well, who is developing a regulatory account of adaptivity, also with Cristian Saporido, who is a philosopher of medicine in Spain. And in Chile, by teaching this account and at the School of Medicine. And I think that working with Carla Benaglio, who is a nurse and a lecturer in Chile, and who has created a Center for Medical Humanities in Chile, one of the things that medical students and healthcare professionals likes is philosophy of medicine, and environmental philosophy is quite interesting. And also in Spain, I'm working with the Faculty of Architecture, because one of line of working I'm developing is study how space perception, not just environmental perception, affects our daily well-being. And we are doing this with regards to elderly people perception in relation to loneliness and autonomy. And we are trying to adapt the housing to these instances. Okay, this is a restorative landscape. Environmental psychology says that just looking at a landscape could restore your attention and well-being.
Take a 1 minute break, and then we'll have time for questions.
I ran a lot. I didn't see the time.
What are you doing for the break?
The clock on the.
Oh, I think that's perfect.
Okay. Posso terminar un attimo?
For the online audience,
You do free meal.
Yeah.
just repeat the
There are many people, no? Because I don't see. I don't see if there are people over in the Zoom. No?
yeah, we'll handle it if there are questions.
Okay. No. Just to be curious, because now it doesn't seem.
There were about 14 people.
14.
14, yeah.
Oh wow, a lot of friends.
Yeah, all of the views, so it's it's actually it's more like catching up. At least there's a sense. Get another one. Yeah.
Will it be better with that?
I think it's actually quite a nice description of the very but yeah, it's actually good to be done with some of this.
Yes.
Take this.
I know.
Barely have
I'm trying not to. I think we should see the oligarchs' money and funds.
All right, if you have a question, please.
So thank you for that really lovely talk, and especially for the picture of the hummingbird with the red flowers at the end. That was really lovely.
Yeah, it was in San Diego, California, before the pandemic developed. It's a mockingbird.
That was really nice.
Yeah, I know.
I'm wondering if some of the words that you're still using are getting in your way. So when I think about a term like cope, Otto says, or WHO for can one cope with the environment. Cope denotes a problem. Like you have to cope with problems. You don't cope with benefits. You don't cope with things that help you. You cope with problems. So the environment is still like this negative thing you have to cope with. And adaptation, I mean, we could talk about like positive adaptation and changing like the way in which you live to respond to like a subgenic environment. But most of us don't like to think about change. Change is hard. Change is work. Change is difficult. So there's something about adaptation that also suggests like you're making me do this, as opposed to thinking of like the environment as like the necessary background for health. We would all be dead if we went space. I mean, only tardigrades survive in space. And they only hibernate, right? So the relationship we have has to, you know, the positive aspect of the environment is like the first thing, because we're dead without it. There's no health, right? The first thing is this. So then what kind of language might
soften a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Oh, geez.
Okay, for the audience. Hi. So I think that the problem here is that you are questioning the use of negative terms like cope, like adapt. Okay, the point is that we can give a relational and situated account of the health and environment through, for example, cognitive science, and say, okay, I perceive the environment, I'm co-constituted by the environment, and the environment offers me possibilities, and the things is called affordances. But in philosophy of medicine, I think we have to deal with disease, and it's not that a definition of health is always negative, but we have to consider that when managing disease and vulnerability and exposure of people, we have to do something. What we do? Okay, I think that, well, adaptation is used in public health, because as in environmental health, or we mitigate for example, the negative effect of climate change, or we do something. This doing, at least for now, has been calling adapt. In the IPCC report that has been released yesterday, 2 days ago, I've read it super rapidly this morning. The concept of adaptation is still there. The idea of vulnerability, the resilience also is quite interesting. For example, that the idea of resilience is not so positive, because it implies the going back to a previous state after a negative perturbation. But also in that in that report, the idea of adaptation is considered a little bit more in the thing of change. And why change? Because we are not fixed. We are not exposed to an environment like this. The idea of agency, and I go back to one of my first laws, agency and cognitive science imply an action. And well, we could reframe totally the terms used by philosophy of medicine, but I think we can ameliorate them. But this holistic perspective that you imply is on the other side quite problematic, because after a major effect, after a major hurricane, after a major disease, we have to do something. And also philosophy of biology, for example, is trying to not soften, but better characterize the mechanism through which we relate to the environment. We adapt also to the environment. But I'm not sure that the fact that we adapt is something hierarchical and imposed. No, because when you do something from the point of view of healthcare practices or architecture, you have to do something with the situation. I don't know. I understand your concern, but I find a little bit complicated. Reframe all the vocabulary of both environmental philosophy and philosophy of medicine. I'm not at that point, but maybe someone will wait me outside the door and kill me. I don't know.
Yes, thanks. I guess my question might just be a clarification. It's about the sense in which your account is relational. So at the beginning, I thought maybe you were going to say something like, we have to understand health in terms of some sort of relationship between, consisting in some sense, a relationship between an organism or individual, for instance, being something that's constitutive or intrinsic. But then the discussion of things like salutogenesis suggests more that the relationship is causal. Salutogenesis is about the environment causing or promoting health. So I just maybe just a clarification about the sense in which the account is relational one.
Yeah. Well, it is also complicated to define this idea of relational account, because the same terms, relation, could be described in terms of direct causes or multiple causes. I understand your concern. I think that if we follow an idea of adaptivity from the point of view of philosophy of biology, we are looking at multiple causes and multiple mechanisms that help us to adapt to the environment. Of course, this opens a big debate in philosophy of medicine about cause, about causality, and also about environmental relativism. So I think you're right. I need to go deep in that definition of relational.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say a little more about what you take the environment to mean in this context. So you gave a lot of different examples, including like climate change, animal disease vectors, architectural design. So these are all like seemingly sort of quite ontologically dissimilar. So I was wondering if you could just comment on like what you take the environment to include, and if you mean it to be this like super inclusive category, do you think that all parts of the environment are relevant to health, or are there like certain parts that are just relevant to thinking about health?
No, well, okay, for the public there, she's asking how I define the environment. That is another massive problem in what I think in the paper and in the conceptualization of this approach. But well, we could use a general definition of the environment, meaning all the biotic and biotic elements that affect our living and our health. And I try to find a super general definition of the environment, because when we are talking of the element of the environment as affecting our health, we have to not, I think, use a specific definition, but use a multi-scalar approach. So when we are talking about the environment, it's true that we are talking about proximal environment and how it affects our physiology, but also we are talking about how, for example, the healthcare professional environments, such hospitals, such communities, can be ameliorated. So the term environment is general. It's generally described as the surrounding from a point of view of biotic and abiotic way. And in this sense, I follow, for example, the recent OneHealth approach by the WHO, because the OneHealth approach, I didn't have the time to go deep in it, but it's about the fact that it's a general environment like nature, animals that are also part of the environment. I don't understand why they are separated, and humans. So it's more the idea of an ecosystem. So we have to consider the environment in this sense. And also, coming from landscape theory, I cannot forget that the part of the environment is also landscape. So from a cognitive and a perceptual or aesthetical point of view, also when working in healthcare, we have to consider it. And that's another line of, for example, environmental psychology. So the problem I've tried to define in the state of the art is that the environment in medicine, or well, in some cases in philosophy of medicine, is just a pathogenic one. No, so carrier of diseases, one is not well extensively described. But when we talk about environment, just in terms of climate change, that is right, this is correct, but because it's what we are facing now, but it's not sufficient. So we need a wide idea of the environment. Of course, I didn't arrive to define what it is the environment, because I think that if we follow a multi-scale perspective, we have to check step by step what is, in which scale we are working to. Because imagine, for example, the case of the COVID. When we talk about the COVID-19 and the environment, we have to focus on the ecosystem problem, but also for example, in the green spaces, some architectures have been developed to foster health for people, or the spaces of the hospital. So I know that it can be, it seems that I don't have a clear definition of the environment, but because we have to look at the environment at different scales. I don't know if.
Thank you for the talk. I'm afraid that after the first and the third question, I'm struggling right now to articulate my question as something original, because it's related. So actually, it's to some extent the same question as the first one and the third. Your project is based, if I'm not wrong, on the one hand on environmental philosophy, and on the other hand on situated approaches. For example, situated cognition, embodied cognition, as you mentioned, Ezekiel Di Paolo.
Yeah, I use this definition.
Okay,
I'm not a follower of the Church of Embodied Cognition.
Okay, so
no, well, I'm not focused on studying their approach.
Sure.
No, to say, even if it's amazing.
I'm also of the opinion that it's quite amazing. I mean, what Di Paolo is doing, but my question is somehow related to that, because both in environmental philosophy and environmental ethics in particular, and in all these situated approaches, if I get them right, they want to provide some kind of reconceptualization of the subject, meaning that the subject itself is constituted. It not just happened to be in some surrounding, but it's constituted by this relationship with the environment. And now, is this part of your project, this strong notion of constitution, not just location? So this is one concern. And then referring to Di Paolo, he provides a very simplified model. And that's why it's a great thing. Very simplified model of the cognizer in this particular case, and how the cognizer environment relationship is, how it builds up, so to speak. But it begins from a very simple model. Whereas here, I see that we operate at various different levels of abstraction. So would you consider this strategy of providing a very simple model at the beginning and then building on that a good strategy or not? Because we have all these different levels of environment and its complexity. And my second and my final thought is, what do you think? What would you say in reaction to the argument that your project needs some sort of ontology to put all these pieces together? In this particular case, ontology of environments in plural. This is important, environments.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you can take it as a kind of commercial. That's what I do.
Okay.
So what is your view of let's say, a more abstract ontological project in relation to your project?
Okay. Well, the first things I hope Ezekiel is not in the public. No, I don't think. But okay, the first question. I think the body cognition perspective answers the correctly the idea of a self that is constituted socially. But because one of the point of embodied cognition sometimes is that this constitution is socially constructed. And what I think, and as I've written a little bit more about ecological psychology by Gibson and so on, is that in some ways ecological psychology allows us to better develop an idea of the self co-constituted by the environment. So that's for the first question. For the second question, the ontology of the environment. Yes, I can agree with you, but and if you want, we can. I surely can learn more from ontology of the environment. I think that nevertheless, the fact that focusing on the multiscalar perspective on the idea of the environment help us a little bit on the ontological point of view, because one of the problems, both in cognitive science or in the constructivist approach of cognition, is that sometimes the environment is considered as not something not ontological, but something that you build, you construct. Coming from landscape theory and well, practical, also very practical design of the environment, I may agree that the environment is something that is something over there, something a realistic. We can have a realistic approach to the environment. So yes, I think I agree with you on the fact that starting from a more simple model. I don't know, maybe in all these years, starting from a more simple definition, I have some problem, but I will try to simplify a little bit the account. I have maybe this problem that I put too many things together in this account, but I think that it comes maybe from, I don't know, maybe from all the experiences in landscape theory and environmental philosophy, in which we cannot arrive at a precise definition of both the environment and both the landscape. We have to have a pragmatic approach in the evaluating every context we are dealing with.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up to all of them, and I really like the title of or thinking about this relationship between health and the environment, relationally. And I was wondering if maybe actually the concept of relationality could do more work in your account by way of contrasting it to individualism.
Yeah.
Right, because one of the pervasive things that seems to be the case in even the kind of definition of health in according to who is that it's almost assumed that we're these individual silos distinct from other individual humans and other individual animals or environments and so on and so forth. So I wonder, kind of going beyond the relationality of like the self, the environment and the health, you could also kind of talk about like individualistic accounts of health versus more relational accounts of health in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's completely correct. And also in the same definition of coping in medicine is more individualistic based. So how we human beings cope or adjust adapt to a disease, but in terms of its individual approaches. I think, well, through the idea of relation, we can stress more the social implication. But it's true that talking about the environment adds something more than just the sociality. The fact that the sociality has to be defined in a where. That maybe well, I'm very bad at titles. This is clear also in the papers, but maybe that this relational and situated account could be, and could refer also the situated to, I don't know, Haraway and the situated knowledge. Yeah. I was thinking the same. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So follow-ups to follow-up. With the first definition you put up, 1948, you criticized a couple of elements of it. One being the question of complete.
Yeah.
Who's got complete all of this, and that's correct. And then you pointed to it sort of focus on something intrinsic rather than this relational. I wonder if you can actually. I'm a little concerned that once we start taking into account the notion of environments rather than environment, social, physical, animal, so on, and start thinking about how those interact, then adaptation to, let's say, an urban environment might involve compromises with the kind of relationship one can have with animals or with other people.
Yeah.
So once you start realizing that nothing is going to be a complete adaptation to the environments, right? It's all a bunch of a patchwork of small adaptations to different features. You still got to say, well, okay, what is the right trade-off between these things? And once you start trading off, aren't you back then looking at the individual, figuring out what turns out to be the best for the individual health in making those trade-offs? So how do you avoid this kind of more intrinsic conception of well-being that seems to be necessary in order to make sense of those trade-offs?
Okay, so the question is about how, even if I develop a relational account of health due to the, I don't know, climate hazard or climate problems, in the end I cannot go back to the individual. Okay, I think that it is a possibility. We cannot exclude it, because if we think, for example, and here I could introduce a little bit the other case studies we have analyzed in the last in the last period about community-centered medicine. It's not out or out. It's not one or the other. For example, the community-centered medicine is about the fact that healthcare policies are brought out of the hospitals. And so you work as a healthcare professional, you work with communities, NGO, social services, religious groups to do some policies, some measures on the territory. I started working on this thing because during the pandemic, during the break of the pandemic in Bergamo, in Italy, where a lot of people died, a lot of physicians, like 10 physicians, wrote a letter to the British Journal of Medicine, says, okay, we have to stop with these things that we have to focus on the patients, of the individuality of the patients, if we need to focus on community-based medicine. So in order to reduce the number of ICU beds, reduce the number of deaths, in order to reduce the overwhelming and the stress of healthcare professionals, we have to bring healthcare policies outside the hospital. Well, that letter was well, a little bit radical. Italians are always radical, but and because it says, okay, we have to stop with the patient-centered medicine, so focus it on the individual. And also patient-centered medicine has been developed in the medical humanities and in medicine because it paid attention in the last 20 years, finally, to the patients. Okay, thinking about as examples, the Italian physician could be right, but the point is not that focusing on the environment and on community-centered medicine eliminates the individual. It can be complementary. And so this is example, maybe a little bit of verbosity to answer to your question. It's not that if we focus on the environment, on the hazard of the environment, or to healthcare practices which take into account the community, we forget the individual. They can be together.
So this sounds like your answer to John's question. It's a causal count, not a constituent. In the sense that the health here is some balance of relationships with factors of the environment that then produce a kind of individual.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, but it's like in ecological psychology. When you think at how we perceive the environment, it's not a direct causality. It's a multi-factor causality.
Well,
So
I mean, ecological psychology nowadays is not terribly helpful here because their view is a lot more radical.
Yeah, in some
radical view, right? It sounds like you've actually got a more traditional view. It's just saying,
yeah,
hey, to get the right outcomes for individuals, we need to pay attention to these environmental factors. Then my question still is, okay, so tell me how you think they should be traded off. Right? I can't. So I can't have, pets in my office, for instance. Let's say, says that policy should be changed because it's important to have connection with animals, even in
no, but maybe the manager of your building could understand that a way to stop the diffusion of the COVID, instead of simply obliged to put the mask on or to oblige to social distancing, could open the windows. Here is not possible, but
well,
no, but for example, it is a thing that or for example, let's open the park during the quarantine for people to go outside with there are some basic measures that can be provided. One doesn't exclude the other.
So the university could have goats downstairs. But I find it interesting that in the first response to the initial question in this one, you go to like health crisis, like the pandemic, rather than some general everyday just health and well-being.
Well, it's just a case study, but for example, all the literature about restorative environments and restorative landscape goes in the everyday life.
Yeah.
And also the hospitals or parks, everything. So for this reason, I told it needs a multi-scalar analysis.
Again, you have the last word. If you remember your question.
Well, thank you for a super interesting talk. And sorry to bring the discussion to an end with a really simple-minded question.
Yeah.
So it sounded as if you were thinking about health as a function of two very different kinds of factors, namely on the one hand, ability to best cope with environmental threats to health, and on the other hand, the ability to best exploit make the most of affordances and environmental factors that are conducive to health. And it sounded at first as if this was a sort of quite a bit of an opposition, going quite beyond traditional understandings of traditional models of diseases. And I'm wondering, I mean, the examples you then proceeded to give sounded as if this positive bit was mainly about minimizing vulnerabilities to pathogenic factors. So it would basically just stay within this pathogenic understanding and go to the outer rim of it, right? Look at the vulnerabilities. So perhaps you could expand more a bit on how this new focus on affordances goes beyond minimization of vulnerabilities.
Okay, now we went back to affordances. I mentioned it. Oh God, why? No. Well, if we generally consider affordances as possibilities offered by the environment, okay, but otherwise putting here the concept of affordance is a little bit complicated. But your question was about vulnerability.
And to what extent this new focus on salutogenesis could go beyond merely minimizing?
Yeah. Sorry. Maybe I didn't explain it correctly. But the fact is that, well, vulnerability is something that refers to the idea that we are exposed to something negative. And there is, for example, an ongoing research called exposome, which makes a long list of all the negative elements of the environment, like endocrine perturbators, to which we are exposed. So all the negative things. We are vulnerable, we are poor human beings exposed to a series of things that make us not healthy. But if we introduce just to say. But but if we follow a salutogenic approach, we ameliorate the preventive approach in the sense that we create a positive environment before being exposed. You don't create like I don't know, you don't create a positive environment after the disasters has occurred. You don't just in some cases of adaptation. You don't build a passive house buildings after that all the energy has been cut off in Europe. You try to do it before. Huh? That's okay. I don't know why these examples are emerging today, but is, for example, the idea of salutogenesis in Antonovsky is often represented like this this idea. If we follow a pathogenic approach to medicine, we are helping people not to drown in the river of life. Please use this metaphor. If we use a salutogenic approach, we are helping people to learn how to swim. So it's a very basic example, but he used it in the 1979. And the idea of salutogenesis as something preventive and not just blocking the perturbation, that is a little bit the idea of activity, goes in this direction. I don't know if
we leave it there.
At least you think that the pathogenicity account is just simply preventive and is another form of blocking a perturbation, but it's not.
Right. We need to start doing our cultural center.
Thank you.
All right, have a good break and see you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. The people online just disappear.
It is possible.
I want to dog in my
Sí.